Chapter 32. Less than an hour later, the last three survivors of the company from Rampling Steep made their way into Bone Hollow and found PL's body. It lay midway through, sprawled loose and uncaring upon the earth, lifeless gaze fixed upon the distant sky. One hand clutched the rune-marked leather bag that contained the black elf stone. The stealth was still in its sheath. Walkerbow glanced about curiously. Quickening's magic had worked its way through Bone Hollow, changing it so that it was no longer recognizable. Sawgrass and jumpweed grew everywhere in tufts that shaded and softened the hard surface of the rock. Patches of yellow and purple wildflowers bent to find the sun, and the bones of the dead had faded back into the earth. Nothing remained of what had been. "Not a mark on him," Horner Dees muttered, his rough face creased further by the frown that bent his mouth. His voice wandering, he moved forward, bent down to take a close look, then straightened. "Neck might be broken, ribs crushed, something like that, but nothing that I can see. Little blood on his hands, but that belongs to the girl. And look, coding tracks all around, everywhere. They had to have caught him, yet there's not a mark on his body. How do you like that?" There was no sign of the coding. It was gone, disappeared as if it had never been. Walker tested the air, probed the silence, closed his eyes to see if he could find the coding in his mind. No. Quickening's magic had set it free. As soon as the chains that bound it were broken, it had gone back into its old world, become itself again, a bear only, the memories of what had been done to it already fading. Walker felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle through him. He had managed to keep his promise after all. "Look at his eyes, will you?" Horner Dees was saying. "Look at the fear in them. He didn't die a happy man, whatever it was that killed him. He died scared." "It must have been the coding," Morgan Lee insisted. He hung back from the body, unwilling to approach it. Dees glanced pointedly at him. "You think so? How, then? What did it do? Hug him to death? Must have done it pretty quick if it did. The knife of it isn't even out of its case. Take a look, Highlander. What do you see?" Morgan stepped up hesitantly and stared down. "Nothing," he admitted. "Just as I said," Dees sniffed. "You want me to turn him over? Look there." Morgan shook his head. "No." He studied PL's face a moment without speaking. "It doesn't matter." Then his eyes lifted to find Walker's. "I don't know what to feel. Isn't that odd? I wanted him dead, but I wanted to be the one who killed him. I know it doesn't matter who did it or how it happened, but somehow I feel cheated. As if the chance to even things up had been taken away from me." "I don't think that's the case, Morgan," the dark uncle replied softly. "I don't think the chance was ever yours in the first place." The Highlander and the old tracker stared at him in surprise. "What are you saying?" Dees snapped. Walker shrugged. "If I were the king of the Silver River, and it was necessary for me to sacrifice the life of my child to an assassin's blade, I would make certain her killer did not escape." He shifted his gaze from one face to the other and back again. Perhaps the magic that Quickening carried in her body was meant to serve more than one purpose. Perhaps it did. There was a long silence as the three contemplated the prospect. "The blood on his hands, you think?" Horner Dees said finally. "Like a poison?" He shook his head. "Makes as much sense as anything else." Walkerbow reached down and carefully freed the bag with the black elf stone from PL's rigid fingers. He wiped it clean, then held it in his open palm for a moment, thinking to himself how ironic it was that the elfstones would have been useless to the assassin. So much effort expended to gain possession of its magic, and all for nothing. Quickening had known. The king of the Silver River had known. If PL had known as well, he would have killed the girl instantly and been done with the matter. Or would he have remained anyway, so captivated by her that even then he would not have been able to escape? Walkabow wondered. What about this? Horner Dees reached down and unstrapped the stealth from around PL's thigh. What do we do with it? Throw it into the ocean, Morgan said at once, or drop it in the deepest hole you can find. It seemed to Walker that he could hear someone else speaking, that the words were unpleasantly familiar ones. Then he realized he was thinking of himself, remembering what he had said when Cogline had brought him the Druid history out of Lost Paranor. Another time, another magic, he thought, but the dangers were always the same. Morgan, he said as the others turned. If we throw it away, we risk the possibility that it will be found again. Perhaps by someone as twisted and evil as PL. Perhaps by someone worse. The blade needs to be locked away where no one can ever reach it again. He turned to Horner Dees. If you give it to me, I will see that it is. They stood there for a moment without moving. 3 worn and ragged figures in a field of broken stone and new green, measuring one another. Dees glanced once at Morgan, then handed the blade to Walker. I guess we can trust you to keep your word as well as anyone, he offered. Walker shoved the stealth and the elfstone into the deep pockets of his cloak, and hoped it was so. They walked south for the remainder of the day, spent their first night free of Eldworth on a barren scrub-grown plain. A day earlier, the plain had been a part of Earl Belk's kingdom, infected by the poison of the Morgrint, a broken carpet of stone, even with nothing more than the scrub to brighten its expanse. It felt lush and comforting after the deadness of the city. There was little to eat yet, a few roots and wild vegetables, but there was fresh water again. The skies were star-filled, and the air was clean and new. They made a fire and sat up late, talking in low voices of what they were feeling, remembering in the long silences what had been. When morning came awake, the sun on their faces, grateful simply to be alive. They travelled down again through the high forests and crossed into the charnels. Horner Dees took them a different way this time, carefully avoiding Deed Charisman's tribe of herders, journeying east of the spikes. The weather stayed mild, even in the mountains, and there were no storms or avalanches to cause them further grief. Food was plentiful again, and they began to regain their strength. A sense of well-being returned, and the harshness of their memories softened and faded. Morgan Lee spoke often of quickening. It seemed to help him to speak of her, and both Walker and Horner Dees encouraged him to do so. Sometimes the Highlander talked as if she was still alive, touching the sword he carried and gesturing back to the country they were leaving behind. She was there, he insisted, and better that she were there than gone completely. He could sense her presence at times. He was certain of it. He smiled and joked and slowly began to return to himself. Horner Dees became his old self almost as quickly, and the haunted look fading from his eyes, the tension disappearing from his face, the gruffness in his voice lost its edge, and for the first time in weeks, the love he bore for his mountains began to work its way back into his conversation. Walkabow recovered more slowly. He was encased in an iron shell of fatalistic resignation that had stripped his feelings nearly bare. He had lost his arm in the Hall of Kings. He had lost Cogline and Rumour at Hearthstone. He had nearly lost his life any number of times. Charisman was dead. Quickening was dead. His vow to refuse the charge that Eleanor had given him was dead. Quickening had been right. There were always choices, but sometimes the choices were made for you, whether you wanted it so or not. He might have thought not to be ensnared by the Druid machinations, to turn his life away from Bryn Omsford and a legacy of magic, but circumstances and conscience made that all but impossible. His was a destiny woven by threads that stretched back in time, hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, and he could not be free of them, not entirely at least. He had thought the matter through since that night in Eldwas when he had agreed to return with Quickening to the lair of the Stone King in an effort to recover the Black Elf Stone. He knew that by going he was agreeing that if they were successful, he could carry the talisman back into the Four Lands and attempt to restore Paranor and the Druids, just as Alenon had charged him. He knew without having to speak the words what that meant. Make whatever choice you will, Quickening had advised, but what choices were left to him? He had determined long ago to search out the Black Elf Stone. Perhaps from the moment he had first discovered its existence while reading the Druid history, certainly from the time of the death of Cogline, he had determined as well to discover what its magic would do, and that meant testing Alanon's charge that Paranor and the Druids could be restored. He might argue that he had been considering the matter right up until the moment Eldwas had met its end, but he knew the truth was otherwise. He knew as well that if the magic of the Black Elf Stone was everything that had been promised, if it worked as he believed, then Paranor would be restored, and if that happened, then the Druids would come back into the Four Lands through him, beginning with him, and that reality provided the only choice left to him, the one he believed Quickening had wanted to make, the choice of who he would be. If it was true that Paranor could be restored, and that he must become one of the first Druids who would keep it, then he must make certain he did not lose himself in the process. He must make certain that Walker Bow survived. His heart, his ideas, his convictions, his misgivings, everything he was and believed. He must not evolve into the very thing he had struggled so hard to escape. He must not, in other words, turn into Alenon. He must not become like the Druids of old, manipulators, exploiters, dark and secretive conjurers, and hiders of truth. If the Druids must return in order to preserve the races, in order to ensure their survival against the dark things of the world, Shadowin or otherwise, then he must make them as they should be, a better order of men, of teachers, and of givers of the power of magic. That was a choice he could still make, a choice he must make if he were to keep his sanity. It took them almost 2 weeks to reach Rampling Steep, choosing the longer, safer routes, skirting any possibility of danger, sheltering when it was dark and emerging to travel on when it was light. They came on the mountainside town toward midday, the skies washed with a grey cloudy haze left by a summer shower that suggested spun cotton pulled apart by 2 anxious hands. The day was warm and humid, and the buildings of the town glistened like damp, squat toads, hunched down against the rocks. The 3 travellers approached as strangers, seeing the town anew, the first since Eldwas. They slowed as one as they entered the solitary street that navigated the gathering of taverns, stables, and trading stores to either side, pausing to look back into the mountains that they had descended, watching momentarily as the runoff from the storm churned down out of the cliffs into gullies and streams, the sound a distant rush. "Well, time to say goodbye," Horner Dees announced without preliminaries and stuck out his hand to Morgan. Morgan stared. There had been no talk of his leaving until now. "You're not coming with us?" The old tracker snorted. I'm lucky to be alive, Highlander. Now you want me to come south? How far do you expect me to push things? Morgan stammered. I didn't mean... Fact is, I shouldn't have gone with you the first time. The other cut him short with a wave of one big hand. It was the girl who talked me into it. Couldn't say no to her. Maybe it was a sense of having left something behind when I fled the Stone King and his monsters 10 years ago. I had to go back to find it again. So here I am, the only man to have escaped Eldwis and Earl Belk twice. Seems to me that's enough for the one old man. You would be welcome to come with us, Horner Dees, Walker Bow assured him, taking Morgan's part. You're not as old as you pretend, and twice as able. The Highlander and his friends can use your experience. Yes, Horner, Morgan agreed hurriedly. What about the Shadowin? We need you to help fight them. Come with us. But the old tracker shook his bearish head stubbornly. Highlander, I'll miss you. I owe you my life. I look at you and see the son I might have had under other circumstances. Now, isn't that something to admit? But I've had enough excitement in my life, and I'm not anxious for any more. I need the dark quiet of the alehouses. I need the comforts of my own place. He stuck out his hand again. Who's to say they won't change, though? So, some other time, maybe. Morgan clasped a hand in his own. Any time, Horner. Then, forsaking the hand, he embraced the old man. Horner Dees hugged him back. The journey went swiftly after that, time slipping away almost magically, the days and nights passing like quicksilver. Walker and Morgan came down out of the Shannara Mountains into the foothills south and turned west along their threshold toward the Rab. They forded the north branch of the river and the land opened into grasslands that stretched away toward the distant peaks of the Dragon's Teeth. The days were long and hot, the sun burning out of the cloudless sky as the intemperate weather of the mountains was left behind. Sunrise came early and daylight stayed late, and even the nights were warm and bright. The pair encountered few travellers and no Federation patrols. The land grew increasingly affected by the shadow and sickness, dark patches that hinted at the spread of the disease, but there was no sign of the carriers. At week's end, the Dark Uncle and the Highlander reached the south entrance to the Janison Pass. It was nearing noon, and the pass stretched away through the conjuncture of the cliffs of the Dragon's Teeth and the Charnels. A broad, empty corridor leading north to the Strellerheim. It was here that Padishah Creel had hoped to rally the forces of the Southland movement, the dwarf resistance, and the trolls of Axheim and his Celtic rock in an effort to confront and destroy the armies of the Federation. The wind blew gently across the flats and down through the pass, and no one stirred. Morgan Lee cast about wearily, a resigned look on his face. Walker stood silently beside him for a moment. Then he put his hand on the other's shoulders. Where to now, Highlander? He asked softly. Morgan shrugged and smiled bravely. South, I suppose. To Varfleet. I'll try to make contact with Padishah. Hope that he's found Pa and Cole. If that fails, I'll go looking for the Valeman on my own. He paused, studying the other's hard, pale face. I guess I know where you're going. Walker nodded. To find Paranor. Morgan took a deep breath. I know this isn't what you wanted, Walker. No, it isn't. I could come with you, if you like. No, Highlander. You've done enough for others. It is time to do something for yourself. Morgan nodded. Well, I'm not afraid, if that's what you're thinking. I have the magic of the Sword of Lee again. I might be of some use. Walker's fingers tightened on the other's shoulders, then dropped away. I don't think anyone can help me where I'm going. I think I have to help myself as best I can. The Elfstone will likely be my best protection, he sighed. Strange how things work out. If not for quickening, neither of us would be doing what he is or even be who he is, would he? He's given us both a new purpose, a new face, maybe even a new strength. Don't forget what she gave up for you, Morgan. She loved you. I think that in whatever way is able, she always will. I know. Horner Dees said you saved his life. You saved my life as well. If you hadn't used the sword, even broken as it was, Earl Belk would have killed me. I think Pa and Cole Omsford could ask for no better protector. Go after them. See that they are well. Help them in any way you can. I will. They clasped hands and held tight for a moment, eyes locked. Be careful, Walker, Morgan said. Walker's smile was faint and ironic. Until we meet again, Morgan Lee. Then Walker turned and walked into the pass, angling through sunlight into shadow as the rocks closed about. He did not look back. For the remainder of the day and the whole of the one following, Walkerbow travelled west across the Strelheim, skirting the dark ancient forests that lay south, cradled by the peaks of the Dragon's Teeth. On the third day he turned down, moving into the shadowed woods, leaving the plains and the sunshine behind. The trees were massive, towering sentinels, set at watch like soldiers waiting to be sent forth into battle. Thick trunks grown close in camaraderie and limbs canopied against the light. These were the forests that for centuries past had sheltered the Druid's keep against the world beyond. In the time of Shay, Omsford, there had been wolves set at watch. Even after, there had been a wall of thorns that none could penetrate but Alanon himself. The wolves had gone now, the wall of thorns as well, and even the keep itself. Even the trees remained, wrapped in a deep, pervasive silence. Walker navigated the trails as if he were a shadow, passing soundlessly through the sea of trunks across the carpet of dead needles, lost in the roil of his increasing indecision. His thoughts of what he was about to do were jumbled and rough-edged, and whispers of uncertainty that he had thought safely put to rest had risen to haunt him once again. All his life he had fought to escape Brent Omsford's legacy. Now he was rushing willingly to embrace it. His decision to do so had been long in coming and repeatedly questioned. It had resulted from an odd mix of circumstances, conscience and deliberation. He had given it as much thought as he was capable of giving, and he was convinced that he had chosen right. But the prospect of its consequences was terrifying nevertheless, and the closer he came to discovering them, the deeper grew his misgivings. By the time he arrived at the heart of the forest and the bluff on which Paranor had once rested, he was in utter turmoil. He stood for a long moment, staring upward at the few stone blocks that remained of what had once been the outcroppings, at the streaking of red light across the bluff's crest where the sunset cast its heated, withering glow. In the shimmer of the dying light, you could imagine it was possible to see Paranor rise up against the coming night. Its parapets, sharply defined in its towers, piercing the sky's azure crown like spears. He could feel the immensity of the keep's presence, the sullen bulk of its stone. He could touch the life of its magic, waiting to be reborn. He built a fire and sat before it, awaiting the descent of night. When it was fully dark, he rose and walked again to the bluff's edge. The stars were pinpricks of brightness overhead, and the woods about him were anxious with night sounds. He felt foreign and alone. He stared upward once more at the crest of the rise, probing from within with his magic for some sign of what waited. Nothing revealed itself. Yet the keep was there. He could sense its presence in a way that defied explanation. The fact that his magic failed to substantiate what he already knew made him even more uneasy. Bring back lost Paranor and the Druids, Eleanor had said. What would it take to do so? What beyond possession of the Black Elf Stone? There would be more, he knew. There would have to be. He slept for a few hours, though sleep did not come easily, a frail need against the whisper of his fears. He lay awake at first, his resolve slipping away, eroded and breached. The trappings of a lifetime's mistrust ensnared him, working free of the restraints under which he had placed him, threatening to take control of him once again. He forced himself to think of quickening. What must it have been like for her, knowing what she was expected to do? How frightened she must have been. Yet she had sacrificed herself because that was what was needed to give life back to the land. He took strength in remembering her courage, and after a time the whispers receded again, and he fell asleep. It was already daybreak when he awoke, and he washed and ate quickly, woodenly anxious in the shadow of what waited. When he was done, he walked again to the base of the bluff and stared upward. The sun was behind him, and its light spilled down upon the bluff's barren summit. Nothing had changed, no hint of what had been or what might be revealed itself. Paranor remained lost in time and space and legend. Walker stepped away, returning to the edge of the trees, safely back from the bluff. He reached into the deep pockets of his cloak, lifted free the pouch that contained the Black Elf Stone. He stared blankly at it, feeling the weight of its power pressed against him. His body was stiff and sore. His missing arm ached. His throat was as dry as autumn leaves. He felt the insecurities, doubts, and fears begin to rise within him, massing in a wave that threatened to wash him away. Quickly, he dumped the elf stone into his open palm. He closed his hand instantly, frightened to look into its dark light. His mind raced. One stone, one for all, one for heart, mind, and body. Made that way, he believed, because it was the antithesis of all other elf stones created by the creatures of the old world of fairy. A magic that devoured rather than expended, one that absorbed rather than released. The elf stones that Eleanor had given to Shay Onsford were a talisman to defend their holders against whatever dark magic threatened. But the Black Elf Stone was created for another reason entirely, not to defend, but to enable. It was conceived for a single purpose, to counteract the magic that had been called forth to spirit away the Druid's keep, to bring lost Paranor out of limbo again. It would do so by consuming that magic and transferring it into the body of the stone's holder himself. What that would do to him, Walker could only imagine. He knew that the stone's protection against misuse lay in the fact that it would work the same way no matter who wielded it and for what purpose. That was what had destroyed Earl Bell. His absorption of the Morgrint's magic had turned him to stone. Walker's own fate might be similar, he believed, yet it would be also more complex. But how? If use of the Black Elf Stone restored Paranor, then what would be the consequence of transference to him of the magic that bound to the keep? Whosoever shall have cause and right shall wield it to its proper end. Himself. Yet why? Because Alanon had decreed that it must be so. Had Alanon told the truth, or simply a part of the truth? Or was he games playing once more? What could Walkabow believe? He stood there, solitary, filled with the indecision and dread, wondering what it was that had brought him to this end. He saw his hand begin to shake. Then suddenly, unexpectedly, the whispers broke through his defences in a torrent and turned to screams. No! He brought the black elfstone up almost without thinking, opened his hand, and thrust the dark gem forth. Instantly, the elfstone flared to life, its magic a sharp tingling against his skin. Black light, the non-light, the engulfing darkness, whosoever. He watched the light gather before him, building on itself, shall have cause and right. The backlash of the magic rushed through him, shredding doubt and fear, silencing whispers and screams, filling him with unimaginable power, shall weld it to its proper end. Now he sent the black light hurling forth, a huge tunnel burrowing through the air, swallowing everything in its path, engulfing substance and space and time. It exploded against the crest of the empty bluff, and Walker hammered back as if struck by an invisible fist. Yet he did not fall. The magic rushed through him, bracing him, wrapping him in armour. The black light spread like ink against the sky, rising, broadening, angling first this, then that, channeling itself as if there were runnels to be followed, gutters down which it must flow. It began to shape. Walker gasped. The light of the black elfstone was etching out the lines of massive fortress, its parapets and battlements, and its towers and steeples. Walls rose and gates appeared. The light spread higher against the skies, and the sunlight was blocked away. Shadowings cast down by the castle enveloped Walkabow, and he felt himself disappear into them. Something inside him began to change. He was draining away. No, rather he was filling up. Something the magic was washing through him. The other, he thought, weak before its onslaught, helpless and suddenly terrified. It was the magic that encased Lost Paranor being drawn down into the elfstone and into him. His jaws clenched and his body went rigid. I will not give way. The black light flooded the empty spaces of the image atop the bluff, colouring it, giving it first substance and then life. Paranor, the Druid's keep, come back into the world of men, returned from the dark half-space that had concealed it all these years. It rose up against the sky, huge and forbidding. The black elfstone dimmed in Walker's hand. The non-light softened and then disappeared. Walker's hoarse cry ended in a groan. He fell to his knees, racked with sensations he could not define and riddled with the magic he had absorbed, feeling it course through him as if it were his blood. His eyes closed and then slowly opened. He saw himself shimmering in a haze that stole away the definition of his features. He looked down in disbelief, then felt himself go cold. He wasn't really there anymore. He had become erased. He forced his terror aside and climbed back to his feet. The black elfstone still clutched in his hands. He watched himself move as if it were someone else, watched the shimmer of his limbs and body, and the shadings that overlapped and gave him the appearance of being fragmented. Shades, what has been done to me? He stumbled forward, scrambling to gain the bluff, to reach its crest. Not knowing what else to do, he must gain Paranor, he sensed. He must get inside. The climb was long and rugged, and he was gasping for breath. By the time he reached the keep's iron gates, his body reflected in a multitude of images, each a little outside of the others. But he could breathe and move as a normal man. He could feel as if he had before. He took heart from that, and hastened to reach Paranor's gates. The stone of the keep was real enough, hard and rough to its touch, yet forbidding too. in a way he could not immediately identify. The gates opened when he leaned into them, as if he had the strength of 1,000 men and could force anything that stood before him. He entered cautiously. Shadows enfolded him. He stood in a well of darkness. There was a whisper of death all about. Then something moved within the gloom, detached and took shape. A four-legged apparition, hulking and ominous. It was a moorcat, black as pitch with luminous gold eyes. There and not there, like Walker himself. Walker froze. The moorcat looked exactly like. Behind the cat a man appeared, old in a stoop, and translucent ghost, shimmering as the man drew near. His features became recognizable. "At last you've come, Walker," he whispered in an anxious, hollow voice. The dark uncle felt the last vestiges of his resolve fade away. The man was Cogline.